How can simple, consistent routines create a classroom where students communicate confidently in the target language every day? In this episode, we look at how effective routines lead to successful classrooms. I'm joined by Tia Parnell, a French teacher in Ontario, Canada. Tia shares practical insights into how routines can create structure, boost engagement, and support meaningful language use. Everything from warm-ups and transitions to handling disruptions. So, let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mis amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and just like I start every single episode, I'm reminding you you're an incredible educator. You're listening to a podcast about language teaching. You're listening to teachers talk about teaching so that you can think about your own classroom and what you're doing, and that just makes you an incredible educator. So thank you. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about routines in the language classroom, and not just routines, but engaging routines, those things that we are doing in the classroom that help us to stay in the target language. And so I will be speaking with Tia Parnell, who is a French teacher in Ontario in Canada, and she is just outside of Toronto, and she has been teaching French there for 7 years, and she has had experience teaching in core French, which she will tell you what that means if you are outside of Canada, as well as teaching in immersion at the elementary level and the beginning of the middle school level as well. You may have seen her present at Practical and Comprehensible, and she's also done her own virtual conference. So I'm so excited to hang out with Tia here today and to talk about routines and our language classroom. So Tia, bienvenue, welcome.
Thank you. Bonjour. It's so exciting to finally connect with you on here. I know we've seen each other in the online space, but never face to face. I guess for listeners, it would be by audio, but for us, it's face to face, sort of.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. I like to point out to listeners that usually when I am speaking with someone, we are not physically in the same space. So I am in Boston, in Massachusetts, in the US, and Tia is in Ontario, but we are looking at each other on a screen and having this conversation. So it feels real for us. So, Tia, I mentioned that you had a stint of teaching core French and you also teach immersion. So, for those of us who might not be in Canada using that language, when we say core French as opposed to immersion, what does that mean?
So here in Canada, specifically in Ontario where I'm teaching, it's broken down into two programs, like you mentioned, the core French and the French immersion. And what it comes down to is a matter of hours of French instruction that students are given throughout their school career from kindergarten, I guess, to grade 12. So with core French, the number of hours is significantly less than the French immersion path. With the French immersion path, if students, stay in the program all the way until they graduate in grade 12. They also graduate with a certificate of bilingualism, which is amazing. It has so many advantages, but the core French program is also really great because regardless of whether or not students decide to opt in for French immersion, they still have that exposure to the French language through core French. Usually it's once or twice a week as you get into the upper grades, but when they're younger, it can be as often as 3 or 4 times a week, just depending on how schedules work. So 2 very different programs, but both with the same goal of bringing French language into Canadian classrooms, particularly Ontario classrooms.
And you specifically as a student growing up and engaging with French, were you part of core learning French or were you a part of an immersion program?
I actually followed the French immersion pathway. So I started French immersion in kindergarten and then went all the way to grade 12. I had a bunch of different subjects that were in French throughout the way, things like science and history and careers and civics, as well as just regular French language classes. And then after that, since I graduated with my certificate of bilingualism, I decided to continue to pursue those French studies at the University of Waterloo, where I did graduate with my Bachelor of Arts and then later go on to go to Teachers College and eventually become an educator, which is so great.
Wonderful. I can hear the excitement about teaching in your voice and as you're talking about it. And that's wonderful to hear. We often hear some of the struggles and the challenges of teaching. And I do not want to discredit the fact that those exist, but I love hearing when teachers are just excited and love what they do. So thank you for keeping at it and being here today to talk about what we're doing in our classrooms, to talk to us about what you're doing in your classroom so that we can all learn from each other. So our topic today is going to be about routines, as I mentioned earlier. And I have seen in your blog writing and your reels, and I have to say, everyone, you have to follow her on social media. That's how I found you. So I have to mention that's how I know who you are. So I have seen that you describe routines as the backbone of the classroom. So what are those key elements that make a classroom routine effective, but also not just incredibly complex? So it's effective, but simple. And so talk to us about really seeing that as the backbone of our classrooms.
For sure. So when I think of routines, I think of three very specific things. I think of clarity, consistency, and flexibility. And those have just been something that has stuck with me from the beginning of my teaching practice. Obviously, as a new teacher, I was a little bit lost just trying to navigate, the classroom world. And I was a little scatterbrained, so my classroom management and the way that I ran my classroom was scattered, and I noticed my students struggling. And so when I took the time to really reflect on what was going wrong, what it came down to was that we didn't have routines in place. So when I talk about these things of like clarity, consistency, and flexibility, for clarity, it's things like, you have a mental checklist that you want to go through in the morning. You get to school, you take your bag off. This is as an adult. Maybe I get my planner out and things like that. I want my students to also have that clarity in the morning. So by having some sort of routine, I'm giving them something to walk into that is predictable and that is something that they're ready to do. So for example, they could walk in, they greet me, and then they start working on like their morning journals, or there's a question on the board for them to answer, things like that. With consistency, I think that also ties into that of just setting that tone for every single day. I want the classroom to be a predictable space for my students because we don't know what's going on at home. We do know that sometimes we do have students who struggle, some students who love coming to school, some students who don't. The best I can do to support that is to make sure that they are coming into the same thing every day because we know how challenging disruptions can be for students. So I'm kind of like crazy. I like to stand at a really specific place outside of my classroom door. There's a little X on the floor that I put with tape, and the kids know like that's where I stand. And I greet them all when they come in, right? And it seems so silly to the outside. We're like, oh, you have to stand right here. But it puts me in a position that I have a positive interaction with them at the first thing before they even come into the classroom. So we like to try to get them off, on a positive note. Greeting them very kindly and making them feel confident walking into that room. And then in terms of flexibility, we know life happens, anything from a recess running late to a fire drill. Like we can't always follow these routines to a T. And being okay with that and being flexible in your routine gives the kids that opportunity to also learn like, hey, we can adjust when things are not what they're supposed to be, and we can kind of get back to where we want to be. So I think of things like we do brain break activities. If I notice there's like a lot of energy in the room and maybe we need to go run a lap outside, we do that. That's okay, right? Something short, something sweet. But when it involves blending all three of those elements together, you really do give your students a routine and a classroom that just feels safe and comfortable, which is what we all are striving for.
I really like the clarity, consistency, flexibility framework because I think as teachers are thinking about what they do in their own classrooms, and if they are thinking, oh, things aren't working well in my classroom and it's not something that seems sustainable or whatever it is, that if they can just take these three words and with the clarity, like, is it really clear to students? Am I doing it consistently? And are they? And am I remaining flexible? So even just having that in their own spaces and seeing that. And the other term where you said a predictable space, that is going to be like my new hashtag mantra. I love
I love
hearing
it.
that. Like, yes, right? And just like talking about that idea of it's predictable for students. Because I think sometimes when teachers think about routine, they can think that, oh, it's the same thing every day and it can get boring. But that's where that flexibility comes in. So it's not necessarily like that. But hearing you frame it as a predictable space makes it sound just more welcoming to me, just using that terminology.
For sure. And like, I think what's so great about predictable, and like you mentioned, is just because it's predictable doesn't mean it has to be boring. So my students come in knowing that there is going to be an activity that they are supposed to work on right away. The activity could be different every single week, but they're okay with that because they know at the end of the day, they're coming in to an activity. So
Mhm.
that's why I love to like remind teachers that there is no right or wrong way to do it. I just would like to help you find the tools to do it so it makes your life as easy as possible.
And so when you have this predictable space, I'm going to go between that and routine. What are the benefits of that for you as the teacher, as well as for the students and that learning environment, creating that predictable space?
Well, I think it helps overall, like exponentially, especially for teachers, right? Because you walk into the room, if you know you have to do a morning activity, maybe you change it up once a week, you could plan that all out in one sitting. You could actually sit down and say, there's X amount of weeks that we are in school, and this is what I'm doing every single week. One week we're focusing on journal writing, one week we're focusing on word problems, whatever it is, something creative, like totally your choice. But that makes it easier from a planning perspective. It takes the stress out of that. And I think what I've learned after all of these years, and it's not that many years of teaching, but it's enough that I can say that my time is valuable. And I want to make sure that I am being efficient with that time and not overwhelming myself, because I do see a lot of burnout happening. I see a lot of teachers who are pouring their soul and their time in and they have nothing left for themselves. And so that's why I really do stress, creating these systems that work for your classroom that make your life outside of the classroom equally as great, right? I know it's a job. I know sometimes jobs and they have tricky things. That's okay. That's part of the learning experience, just as someone who is working. But I think as a teacher, especially, it is very easy to fall into that burnout. So we like predictable because it really does help cut your planning time down. And then from the student perspective, like we said, it's easier for the students to know they're coming into something. It mentally sets you up for an expectation. And when you're teaching in a French classroom, I think you have the added challenge that it is a second language for most kids, right? So by having some sort of routine or something that they know they're going to walk into, their mindset flips from, okay, like I'm being silly and crazy, to now it is time for me to focus. I'm working on my second language and I'm dedicated to doing that. Sure, there'll be little behavior blips because that's
Mhm.
just life, but we do want to make sure that we give them the opportunity to be successful right from the moment they walk into the classroom.
You mentioned earlier your routine of the students coming into the classroom. And if we can sort of look at different times within, say, an hour, say you're working with students for an hour, and I know you have an immersion situation. So I want to make sure that teachers listening to this, if they are in a core teaching situation, that these are, applicable to them as well. But what are some examples of routines, like two or three of them, that are maybe early on in the class that are setting the tone, something maybe mid class that you're doing, and something that's sort of a wrap up at the end?
For entering, I always make entering the classroom and having the students enter a production, because I think it really just clicks their brains on that it is time to learn French. So if you are in immersion, this is kind of probably something you would do at the beginning of the day. If you're a core French teacher and you're seeing a lot of different classes in the day, you're going to feel like you're hosting a talk show and everybody's walking in every single time, and you're doing it a lot, but that's okay because you're seeing a lot more groups and you want to get everybody really excited and engaged right from the beginning. So you could do anything. I like to have a little poster with 5 little French expressions, anything from bonjour, like allo, salut, different French, sometimes in different dialects as well. So that was one thing that my colleague did. He's very talented and he is very much into linguistics. So he actually made us a sheet that had different greetings in French in different dialects. So, what they would say like in the Senegal, and then like what they would say in France. And you had to try and say it as best you could with the knowledge that you had based on these francophone countries. So love that. I thought that was a really really cool activity for the beginning of the day. Midday, I usually just kind of do a check-in. That can be anything from getting their attention with a song. That's a creative way to do it. If you notice your students are starting to drift off a little bit and you really want to rope them back in the middle of a block or whatever, just quietly play a song and put it in French and make it a little bit louder. And as it gets louder, you'll start to see your students kind of stop talking and stop being disrupted to listen to the song. And so I've done this a couple times, and it's kind of a way to bring their focus back on the task. So we listen to the song, and then the song ends and I say, okay, like everybody back to what they're doing. And everyone's like, okay, that's cool. We had a little music break, so let's move on with that. Again, super easy and is applicable to both the core and the French immersion setting.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of the class, I don't really have for like a specific routine because I teach immersion at the end of the hour. There's not really anything to signal that like, okay, we're done, because we're kind of just usually moving on to something else. So if we're moving on to a different subject, a different activity, I do give them the opportunity for quick games, quick brain break, whatever it is. We do one as a class, which is very fun. I like to kind of have students be competitive with themselves because I want to foster that culture of like positivity and fun in our class. So play the alphabet game. They all stand in a line and we go through the alphabet, and everyone has to say whatever the letter is. Like if it's the letter A, they have to come up with a French word that starts with the letter A. And then the next person in line has to do B and C, and we time it. And then at the end of the period, we're like, okay, it took us 1 minute and 26 seconds to get through the alphabet. We'll do the same thing at the end of the day, and they try to beat their own time. They love this. I've been doing this for years, and it's super fun for them. So those are just some examples of routines, because they do all foster kind of that confidence and engagement. But you can do whatever appeals to your students. I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's what's so great about these things is there's no limit.
Yeah, you gave the example of when they hear the music, and it's sort of like that Pavlovian response. Oh, this is what we do now, right? And
Cool.
so I'm interested to hear a little bit about transitions, and that was a transition moment. And are there things that you're specifically doing, either language you're using or something like when they hear the music, or there are particular times where they fall into that predictable space? They fall into the routine. Oh, this is what we do now. So how do you set that up? Is it that they are just used to the routine that we do this at this time, or do you have those things that call them to attention to the routine?
First and foremost, we always have a visual schedule. And I say it's for the students, but it's mostly for me because sometimes I get a little lost in my day. Like, what are we supposed to be doing right now? So the visual schedule helps keep everybody accountable. There have been years where I've done like fun little call outs, like I've yelled hello and they've yelled bonjour. And that kind of gets their attention to stop what they're doing to have a conversation with them about what we're doing next. But when it comes to transitions, like you mentioned, I think that we kind of established that at the beginning of the year, where the first time I turned the music on, they're all looking at me like I have 5 heads. They're like, what are you doing? It's the middle of class. I said, just kidding. It's time to move on to the next activity. So they kind of just learn through doing those things as the year goes on. I have seen a lot of teachers who do fun things like little riddles. I don't have a book of French riddles, but I think that's something that I definitely need. I've seen teachers ask their students a riddle, and then they all kind of stop and think about it, and they discuss in their groups, and then they give their answers, and the teacher either says they're right or gives them the answer, whatever it ends up being, and then they move to the next activity. So anything like that helps with transitions. One transition that I really like that is maybe a little bit controversial for others is when they come back from recess. I love silent reading. And everyone's like, silent reading? Like, what are you talking about? That's so old school. That's so boring. I said, no, it is important because I think that with our younger generation, there seems to be a little bit of struggle when it comes to sitting down and focusing on something like reading a book. So, what we do is at the beginning of the year, even if they're in grades 4, 5, and 6, it doesn't matter. We start off with 5 minutes after recess, and then it becomes 10 minutes, and then it becomes 20 minutes. And by usually like October, we're doing 30 minutes of silent reading after recess. And, people will say, well, that's wasted classroom time, especially with immersion. You only see them for so much time. It's not wasted for me when they're getting the chance to read something in French that they enjoy. They get to have a positive experience. And 9 times out of 10, I start to see them sharing books and being like, hey, this is cool. And we're fostering that love of learning peer to peer, which is like my job is so much easier when everybody's
Hmm.
invested. So that's my favorite one, but it's
Yeah.
not everybody's
Yeah.
favorite.
No, I totally understand that. I was covering recess the other day, and I brought a group of third graders. I teach in an elementary and middle school myself, and it was a group of third graders I was out with, and I brought them back into their classroom, and they immediately got their books out and started reading with their teacher. And so I saw that she was doing that, and it got them right there. So I hear exactly what you're saying. I saw it literally yesterday in my school after I brought the kids back in from recess.
That's amazing. That makes
Yeah.
my heart so happy.
So you alluded a little bit earlier. You said, it's not always. We always have those students that they're going to have the little behavior stuff and all that. So if we look at this predictable space, these routines as a classroom management system, so, how have you seen the benefits of keeping to routines and predictability help to keep students a little more in line? If I'll just use that terminology, but they're not misbehaving in some way. So, how have you seen this as a beneficial tool for classroom management?
When something happens, when there's some sort of interruption or behavior, incident, whatever it is, they just know what to do. And they know that when, we're sitting down and reading that, like, I mean, business, we're here to do this job, to regulate our bodies, to get ourselves back in a positive headspace. And for context, I work in a small school that has a lot of behaviors in the school in general. It's just like a little bit of an area where students struggle, just given the community. So we are very used to interruptions. We're used to hearing them outside the classroom door. And I think that's also in part why I feel like it is so important to have routines, is because I was noticing that my students were becoming dysregulated and bothered by like things that were happening, and rightfully so. But I said at the end of the day, my job is to bring them back to focus, to calm, and to learning. So I think that when you set up these routines, we do say it's to make sure the students know what's happening. It's also for the students to know what to do after something challenging has happened. It's almost like a self-regulation for them as well, because if they know they have to sit down and read or sit down and do like a silent activity, they're able to regulate their bodies and put themselves back in a positive mental space.
I think of the word predictability as a form of safety so
Yeah.
that they are not questioning that, so by creating this routine, this predictable space, it's a place where they are feeling the safety of knowing what's coming. And for those students who are just describing, it sounds like they would particularly need what feels like a safe space for them.
I want kids to walk in and feel comfortable. I want to walk in and feel comfortable. I want it to feel like a second home to them, because realistically, they spend just as much time there or comparable to the amount of time they'll spend in the classroom than they do at home. And same with
Mm-hmm.
me. So I want it to be a space that's inviting. And I think that's like one of the best ways to do it, is to make sure that they feel comfortable and embrace that predictability.
Hmm. When we first started talking about this, you mentioned at the beginning of your career, you realized I'm going to need something. So you kind of had those classes that needed this predictable space. They needed this routine. And I'm sure that there are teachers listening to us who are maybe struggling a little bit with creating this kind of space for their students with these routines or this predictable space. So, what advice would you give them to start strong, but then to also maintain the routines? I think we can jump in and try something new, and like, how long do you give it before you say, okay, that didn't work? So like the sustainability and maintaining the routines, what is your advice for that?
So, for teachers who are struggling with routines, my advice would probably be to start small. You're going to end up doing a ton of research, and you're going to see all these videos and all these things, and you're going to go, oh my goodness, I do not know even where to start with that. So, pick like one or two routines. Maybe it's a morning routine, maybe it's a transition strategy, and then just practice them consistently. I would say few weeks, maybe a week and a half, until they start to feel natural. If they're not working, you'll know right away, because no matter how many times you try it, usually after a week, nothing will change. And then you go, perhaps this is not working for me. So don't be afraid to adjust as you go along, just based on what works for your class and what doesn't. Because the examples I provided might have worked for my class one year, but they would absolutely not work for a different class that I have another year. It all depends on your students. And then the most important thing, with all that being said, is to stick with it. Even when things feel rocky and you're like, I think I've made a mistake, you haven't. Give it a little bit of time. And then after a week or so, if you're noticing that it's not working out, then that's fine. But 9 times out of 10, that consistency does pay off. And before you'll know it, you'll be feeling really comfortable in your space, and so will your students.
I'm thinking very much right now of the book Atomic Habits. I don't know if you've read that. If you haven't, you should. I see you grinning, so I'm thinking you have read it. And as you're talking about this, the whole idea behind Atomic Habits is, don't start with that huge goal and you have to start working towards it tomorrow. It's to what are those little tiny increments you can start doing today that can lead to it, and focus on that.
I think of, setting teachers up for micro successes in the classroom. And that sounds really silly, but it's these small things. It's the one time that you ask your students to, maybe you clap and they clap back and everybody stops talking and you're like, oh my goodness, I've done it. So it could be something that small, but you have these repeated successes. And over time, you're building your own confidence as an educator. And as you continue to have these little successes, they'll grow. And before you know it, you'll be able to tackle kind of the bigger challenges that you're facing in the classroom. So you'll hit those goals. It's just don't try to hit them all at once, because I feel like that's extremely overwhelming and you don't want to discourage yourself. We want to start positive.
Yeah, I think sometimes we think as teachers, we want to have these really big, lofty goals, and then we make the process of getting there so challenging, and it's far away, but if you can have what you just referred to as those little successes, that, you can feel that motivation to try it again when it happened once in the class today and it worked really well. I'm going to try it this afternoon, and I'm going to try it again tomorrow, because you have that immediate success rather than the long-term goals. That was the big thing that I took away from Atomic Habits. It's sort of like your motivation will build with those little successes, to use your language. As we're looking at classroom management or routines or predictable spaces in our classrooms, where are you looking for to continue to develop your understanding of all of this?
So I think at the end of the day, something that we can all kind of relate to as language teachers is that there's often not things that are specific to our languages that we're teaching. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to find specifics. So I do like to peruse the internet. I like to look on TikTok and Instagram and see what all teachers are doing, regardless of what language they're teaching, and then adapt it to my classroom. I have my favorite French teachers that I follow. Some of which have really guided me throughout this journey of sharing, resources and things like that. One of them is Madame Andrea. If you are a primary teacher, so like lower elementary, she's incredible. She has so many wonderful reading resources and just everything that helps you build really solid routines in the primary classroom.
She's in Nova Scotia, correct?
She's in Nova Scotia. Yes, I love her.
Yes, I've met her. I've met her at a conference, so I was like, "Oh, okay, I know who she is."
That's so funny. I've always wanted to meet her. We've chatted online for years. Probably like 5+ years. I've never actually met her, but one day we're gonna meet. But she's a really great resource, just in terms of stuff for the younger grades. And then when it comes to upper elementary, I would say specifically for French teachers, I do follow quite a few, but I think the one that sticks out the most is French Frenzy. TPT is her handle on Instagram. Her name's Eliane, and she makes fabulous units. She makes life in the classroom a lot easier for myself, but I know for a lot of other teachers out there too. So definitely check them out. They're wonderful.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. And so I'm sure teachers are very interested in connecting with you as well. And as you were talking about your morning routine as a teacher arriving in your classroom, even before your students, I think the first TikTok video I saw of yours was you arriving in your classroom in the morning and doing your morning routine. Does that sound familiar?
Yes, I have been doing day in the life videos for like a year and a half. And it's always like, welcome to the day in life as a French teacher. Hi, I'm Tia and I teach French. And then I set up like my boards and kind of what I'm going to do for the day. So that's really, I love routines. Can you tell?
Yes, that was so funny because that was the first time I saw it on TikTok a couple of years back, and it was you walking into your classroom, putting down your bag, everything that you do. So when you said that at the beginning, like it's your teacher routine and your students routine, I said, I know what your teacher routine looks like. I've seen videos on it. So that is excellent. So how can our teachers be checking out all of that stuff on Instagram, on TikTok, and connecting with you and being a part of your world.
For sure. So definitely on the socials. I do love to make videos for Instagram and TikTok with different things like routines, teacher tips, and just kind of really giving everyone a glimpse of what life is like in the classroom, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between. If you're looking for things like resources, I also do have a lot of resources specific for French teachers. They're available on Teachers Pay Teachers on my website. Recently, I've dove into courses and memberships. So I offer a lot of different professional development opportunities for teachers, everything from classroom management to, a course that supports teachers who are just kind of coming into the profession. And then monthly memberships that do help with, those resources and having curated resources for the year with a little hint of professional development in it. So you can find all that on my website. It's perfectmomparnell.com. Or just to send me a DM on Instagram. I'm sure I'll get back to everyone.
Yes, I will do that, and make sure that all of your social media handles and your blog website are also in the show notes. And before we head out, I always like to leave teachers with a hearty piece of advice. And you've given us a ton of advice as we've gone through this, but is there one last little tidbit that you could leave with us?
I think so. I think the piece of advice that I'd give is to trust yourself, trust your teaching instincts. It is so easy to get caught up in this pressure of feeling like you have to do things perfectly or follow trends. And the internet is guilty for that. There's good and there's bad on there. But the best thing that you can really do is just to stay true to yourself, to your teaching style, and focus on what works for you and your students. You know your students best. And nobody outside of your classroom knows them as well as you do. So keep that in mind. Keep things simple, make adjustments, and just focus on being consistent and making connections, building strong relationships for your students. When you do that, when you start to just really focus on the you in the classroom rather than, what else is happening on the outside, I find that things just fall into place a little bit easier. So just trust yourself because you do know best.
Well, I very much appreciate your frameworks and your understanding of students and the classroom. And a lot of times when I'm talking to teachers here on the podcast and you see what people are putting in Facebook groups or sharing on social media, that life looks like they have this perfect world, and this is not the case in my classroom. And I very much respect how you mentioned earlier that you have students and you work in a school that has some challenging situations, and you're able to find success within those challenging situations. Because sometimes we lose sight of the fact that when we're talking about this, that we don't have those types of situations. And I very much respect the vulnerability that you had to share that with us as a part of this conversation. And you did it very naturally. It's just who you are. You weren't doing it to prove a point or something. So that, I think, is what resonates with me and resonates with teachers very much. So thank you for being here, and hashtag predictable spaces. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure. I really appreciate connecting with you. It's been awesome.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Tia Parnell? Hopefully you have some tips for enhancing your routines and implementing a few new ones. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Tia Parnell. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together, and we can do that either in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.